Thanks, Raouf. And I think Raouf forgot to mention that in the 1980s, we were on the academic staff of ABU together. So we go back a long way. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. I'm pleased to be here to speak for about 20 minutes and then probably take Q&A after that. And the topic I've been given, which is sufficiently uncontroversial, is beyond political rhetoric, investing in youth as an economic strategy. Well, coming from Nigeria, I think it's important for us to talk about the definition of youth. I suppose, I suppose in every part of the world, it's usually young men and women between the age of 15 and 24. In my country, we've got youth and we have youth. And I'm sure you know that the governing party, the ruling party, PDP, just elected a youth leader who's 60 years old. And if you're from the Niger Delta, it doesn't matter what your age is, you can always claim to be a youth and get payments from Amnesty. So you've got all sorts of militants, some of them older than me, and they say youth. And when you learn English, you know, well, you don't say a youth, but you can say you are a youth, or we are a youth, if you're from the PDP in Nigeria, or if you're in the Nigeria. Well, the purpose of this is to say that it's not really political rhetoric. Our politicians have always said that they will go for youth empowerment, and they've empowered youth. What we now want is to extend that to the youth, as it were. Now, traditional development models have always emphasized the effective combination of physical factors of production, land, labor, and capital as important catalysts for growth. And we keep talking about Africa in general as being a young continent. We talk about a young population. We talk about the potentials of Africa doing to China what China did to Europe. You've got youth, you've got land, you've got labor, you can have education and use of technology and innovation, and you can take away from the Chinese the kind of industries that they took away from Europe. At this point in time, as you know, labor costs in China have more than tripled over the last 20, 30 years. China is no longer competitive in terms of cost of labor. Where it beats Africa is the productivity of labor and the quality of its infrastructure. I've said this and begin to sound like a broken record. There is absolutely no reason why goods that can be produced with semi-skilled labor and land should land in Africa cheaper than goods produced in Africa. There's no reason why we should import textiles from China, no reason why we should import tomato paste, no reason why we should import processed rice, no reason why we should import starch. We've got all the raw materials. It's about basically converting that into value-added economics. At the moment, for most African countries, the focus has been on resource endowments. So in Nigeria, it's oil and gas. You go outside Nigeria, it's all sorts of commodities that are being exported to China and India and Europe and America. When the price is good, these deliver economic growth, usually to an enclave economy. Growth is not inclusive. Employment is not intensive in those areas. There is absolutely no value added, and therefore we're having growth that does not translate into poverty alleviation. And you've got all these young men and women, some of them educated, many of them not, basically on the street, and that is at the heart of a lot of the social and political insecurity that we have in our countries. So you've got countries like India and China and Brazil and South Korea that effectively use their young population at the right time, while we have focused so much on factor intensity rather than productivity of factors. But resource base is finite, and value added is insignificant when you're in primary sectors. Commodity prices are highly volatile and exogenous, and the continent is therefore a price taker. So we've been talking in the last, and many economic policymakers in Africa talk about the very high growth of GDP in African economies. And that's true. Nigeria has had GDP growth an average of 7% per annum for the last 10 years. Now the question is, have we grown by 7% annually as a result of what we did? Or have we grown at 7% annually in spite of what we did not do? It's fine to talk about growth, but how much of that growth is a result of a deliberate economic policy, and how much of it is just good luck? I do not mean to make a pawn on the name of senior politicians in the country, but how much of it really? I mean, if you have a 7% growth and half of that growth comes from agriculture, okay, you need to ask what were the deliberate economic policies that were pursued to lead to agricultural growth? If it's just about bringing more land under cultivation, about God being kind enough to give us good rainfall, then if you had famine, 7% becomes 3%. If, for instance, the drought that hit Niger in the last few years had come to northern Nigeria, would have had growth of 4% or 3% instead of 7%. If oil price goes up and you're able to take advantage of that and get oil price GDP, how much of that really is due to policy? So the problem with most African countries is that this growth is good, but highly vulnerable, because it is not growth that can be attributed to deliberate policy. And the only way to reduce that vulnerability is to have growth that is driven by factors that you can trace to deliberate policy action, and these are structural. How do you move from being an exporter of tomato and importer of tomato paste to an exporter of tomato paste? How do you move? I mean, Nigeria is the country I use as an example because it's the country I know. I'm sure many African countries, you can just take Nigeria and substitute for another country. This is the 7th largest oil producer in the world. But you know, the biggest export of the UK to Nigeria is petroleum products. We have the world's 6th largest gas reserves, and we generate only 5,800 megawatts of electricity. We are the world's #1 producer of cassava. We import starch and ethanol. And we spend a lot of money transporting cassava from the farms to the few starch plants we have. And what are we transporting? We're transporting water. We have a large cotton belt. We import textiles from China. We have a large tomato belt in the north. We're the world's biggest importer of tomato paste. We import from China. What we don't get from China, we import from Italy from a factory owned by the Chinese. Okay, and I can go on and on. And what is true of Nigeria is true of most African countries. It's about moving away from primary sectors to secondary sectors. And the only way you can do that is to build labor with the right skills that can add value to primary products and move more and more towards the market. And a number of African countries have done that. And this is Africa society, so we're not just here to talk about Nigeria. Ethiopia today, if you go to any Starbucks shop in the world, anywhere in the world, and take coffee, today, that coffee comes from Ethiopia. Okay, and this was achieved over a 3-year period, working with the IFC, basically fixing the coffee value chain. Okay, the Ethiopian government stopped the exports of leather products. Okay, stopped the exports of raw skins and hides and wet blue, made very expensive. Now the Chinese are producing leather in Ethiopia and exporting from Ethiopian soil. Okay, countries like Botswana, countries like Mozambique, countries like Ghana have made a lot of progress on the agricultural value chains, building bread baskets, reducing dependence on imported food. Malawi, despite all the problems. So there are some good stories in Africa, but that is the direction in which to go. But we're here to discuss youth. And where to begin, obviously, with youth is to say, what do you need to do in order to convert youth into an economic resource rather than a curse? Because just like oil can be a blessing or a curse, this population that we have can be a blessing or a curse. if you have a large young population that is not educated, or whose education is not relevant to your stage of development, all you do is increase the dependency ratio. You just reduce per capita income, and you have an army, okay, that could be what Marx called an industrial reserve army, just sitting there and waiting to be used, which is what we're getting to. Because a lot of the time we talk about the problems of Africa, whether it's the ethnic issues or the religious issues, and we think these are ideological or doctrinal. Bottom line, it's economics. It's about people not having a way out of poverty, about people not having hope in the system that they live in. Now, where to begin is education. Education from the very, very beginning at a very young age. Because exposure to poverty and the lack of education continue to contribute to these problems. Education transforms an individual's values. It transforms beliefs and behavior and generally enhances attitudes, thus making that person more productive. Therefore, the quality of education is so critical to development and so critical to empowering the youth. But in addition to invest in education, you've got health. You've got a youthful population in Nigeria. You've got HIV incidence now of 3.1%. Okay, you've got 3 million people living with HIV/AIDS. Most of them 15 to 24, age of 15 to 24, 60% of that, and most of them are female. The incidence with women is 3 times that with young men. Now that is an entire generation facing decimation if it spreads. So you've got to talk about education, you've got to talk about health. You also got to talk about things that we don't talk about, sports. When I was growing up in my country, we used to have what they called Ministry of Youth and Sports. I never understood why, they were together. But now I begin to understand that. Because at that age, sports is not just about your health. It's about learning team building. It's about learning how to be competitive. It's about instilling a sense of patriotism. If you're very good and you wear the national jersey and you actually begin to feel like Nigeria. We all remember the days when Nigeria used to be a major soccer power. And how we would sit down. I mean, by the way, incidentally, I think just this morning I read that Rashidi Yekini is dead, okay, which is a major loss. But we all grew up, we all watched those teams, and you remember what you felt when Nigeria came and almost defeated Italy, but I think Italy got away 2 minutes to full time. But when you're watching that and people wearing the Nigerian jersey and you're not thinking this is a northerner or a southerner or a Muslim or a Christian, sports was one of the ways that built not just the sense of competition, the sense of self-worth, sense of achievement, sense of team building, but also patriotism, and a sense, which is what Africa needs, basically, grow away. I mean, you've got people thinking of themselves now not as French or German, but as European. I mean, the world is moving into wider and wider citizenships where people are beginning to think in a more cosmopolitan manner and see themselves as citizens of the world rather than citizens of an ethnic group or adherents of a particular religious faith. And sports helps that. So these are 3 main forms of investment in youth. And I always say, I use my country as an example, not because Nigeria is the worst country in the world, because country I know, and I'm hoping that those examples would help us draw parallels from our different countries and see that the problems seem to be very pervasive. Now let's talk about education, for example. How much do we as African countries invest in education? And what is the percentage of children of school-going age that we actually give education? The number of institutions keeps multiplying and increasing. I mean, in Nigeria in 2006, we had 56 universities. By 2010, we had 94. 28 federal universities, 32 state universities, 34 private universities. I think we've just passed a legislation to have 9 more universities. Okay? Now, we had colleges of education, 64 in 2005, up to 92 by 2010. We had monotechnics, 30 in 2000, 32 in 2010, and polytechnics, 45 in 2010, down from 57 in 2005. But what's happening to enrollment? In 2001, we had 358,758 students in the universities. By 2007, this number had increased to a little over 1 million. But in 2010, we had only 605,000. 605,000 in a country of 167 million. Okay, so we're having more institutions, we're having much lower enrollment, and we've had, even when we had the increase in number, we had what we called a commodification of graduates, right? Basically quantitative expansion and qualitative, what do you call it? Basically degeneration. So we were producing more and more graduates, and the quality was simply not there. We had an increase in polytechnic enrollment from 188,000 in 2000 to 311,000 in 2005, and that declined again to 229,000 in 2010. The institutions cannot cope. If you look at data from Joint Admissions and Matriculation Board, of the 1 million applications into Nigerian universities in 2003-2004, only 107,000, amounted to 10.3%, were successful. 10.3. But by 2010, it was down to 4.6%. So only 4.6%. Now, there is no way you're going to have advancement when less than 15% of your qualified citizens have access to tertiary education. In the US, it's over 80%. In Europe, the average is 35%. In South Africa and Brazil, it's about 18% and 25% respectively. And you can see the links between an educated workforce and economic growth. Now, primary school enrollment is also low. Estimates from UNDP show that in 2007, 62% of children of primary school age were enrolled in Nigeria, 62%. But this compares to 97% in Finland, 72% in Ghana, 72%, 99% in Korea, 97% in Sweden, 97% in the UK, and 96% in the US in the same year. As for the secondary school enrollment, Nigerian estimates were 26%, compared to 48% in Ghana, 96% in Finland, 95% in Korea, 99% in Sweden, 92% in the UK, and 91% in the US. Again, you go to expenditure on education. We did a comparative analysis of a number of countries, 15 countries, including Nigeria, at various levels between 2006 and 2009. And we got countries like Sweden, Botswana, Ghana, Moldova, France, South Africa, and Canada spending between 5.1% and 9.3% of GDP on education. We took another set, Mexico, Italy, Malaysia, Korea, and Egypt, spending 3.8% to 4.8%. Nigeria spends 2.1% of GDP on education. Now, I'm giving these numbers because when we talk about inclusive growth in economics, we often need to go a step further and talk about structures. Are we addressing the structural bottlenecks that get in the way of inclusion? How do you have a redistribution of income if you do not produce a labor force that has the ability to earn and find a living? So, and structures are not just infrastructure, they're not, we talk about power, which is a problem. We talk about roads and rails and ports. We talk about the right economic policies and institutions, but you've got the soft infrastructure, the human beings. And if you do not have human beings that can work, then that is a structural constraint. In most of the enclave economies that we have, the labor does not even come from the countries. If you go into the oil industry, In many countries, most of the high-skilled labor is imported. We're at a point today where even industries that require semi-skilled labor, construction. You go to a Chinese company doing a road, most of the labor is Chinese. Same thing with manufacturing. We can't continue like this. You can't have a situation where you continue having GDP, but production not coming from Africans themselves because the skills are not there. And that is extremely important. That goes back to the kind of education that we give. Now, for us in the Central Bank, we've tried to get involved in this. We've tried to build entrepreneurship development centers, and I'll give you an experience that we have. We have 3 EDCs in the country. And what we've done historically is to bring people for 2-week courses, teach them how to think a little, teach them how to prepare, financial reports and so on. And last year I said, well, look, let's just do research and find out what percentage of the graduates of these EDCs actually get a job. And we had thousands going through, but very few after that got jobs. Okay, and what we're doing now is changing the entire model and trying to link them up into a value chain. So for example, if we're going to get mechanics, we would get a state government to commit that we're going to spend 6 months or 9 months or whatever training these mechanics on how to build a business plan, how to provide service, how to manage. We would link them to a microfinance bank and encourage that finance bank and give them funding to provide them with single-digit loans, okay, so they have some capital, on the understanding that the state government would send its cars to these mechanics. So you basically start from the beginning, preparing them for a job that is already out there. And that is the kind of thought process that we think needs to go through our educational system and everything we do in the country. I was speaking to a few friends earlier this morning, and I said, you know, these structural issues are just about thinking logically. And from where I sit as a regulator, I can tell you, take the banking industry. And how many of you are from Zambia? Yeah, you guys are headed for trouble in the banking industry. because Zambia has just announced increasing capital requirements for banks by 50 times, which is what we did in Nigeria in 2004. And nobody ever sits down to ask, why do you want big banks? Apart from the fact that South Africa has them. Okay, you want to have, we wanted to have banks like Standard Bank and Absa and Nedbank, fine. So we built these huge financial institutions. And what do? They go and lend to Shell, they lend to ExxonMobil, they lend to MTN. We've got microfinance banks that are lending to very poor people in the villages, and we complain that nobody is lending to agriculture. Nobody is lending to SME. Who's going to lend to them? The big banks that we've created? Or the tiny microfinance banks? And this middle, where in most parts of the world, 65% of export earnings, 70% of employment, half of GDP is produced, is totally unbanked. No large bank is going to spend its time on a small and medium enterprise where you can do a very big loan to Shell. So we've created institutions with our own policies. We have created institutions that have disenfranchised the very parts of the economy that we need to support. So when you go out as youth, not youth, when you go out and set up your small and medium enterprise, you can't find a bank. Your funding requirements are beyond the requirements of a microfinance bank. And for the big banks, you're just too small. And part of the challenge we have now in Central Bank is basically a re-regulation that does not get rid of the big banks, but that creates the incentives and the opportunities for us to have these medium-sized banks, because if we don't change the structure of the banking system, we cannot improve financial inclusion at that level. And it's the same way when you go to education. If you go and produce aeronautical engineers and computer scientists, well, that's fine. But in Nigeria, unless you get Boeing to come and set up a factory, I'm not sure that that is the kind of graduate you want. What skills are we giving the youth? What are the opportunities in our economy that require skills? Why is it that in many parts of the world, it's not about, not everybody is destined to be a philosopher. It's nice to be a philosopher, but even in the olden days, they all used to be aristocrats who didn't have to think about how to earn a living or had some patrons that kept them. Okay? Now, we need to interrogate our educational curriculum and see how we can develop one that is more consistent with our stage of development. We don't just get curricula from other parts of the world and say, this is what we want and this is what we want to have. Broadly, I think these are the kind of things I'd like to talk about. We need to have a proper policy framework with specific benchmarks that reflect challenges. We need to look at the design and implementation of youth capacity building activities. We probably need to involve the youth themselves in policy design. Ask them exactly what are their concerns, what are their aspirations, what are their hopes, what are the opportunities that they see. And we've got to recognize that all of this can only work in an environment where the institutions work. You've got so much corruption. And probably the corrupt system is that the focus is on rent seeking. And we've created perverse incentives. So it's actually easier for someone to look for somebody they know and look for a contract, or maybe pick up arms against the state and be paid under amnesty than to go and work hard and get an education and get an opportunity. The final thing I'd like to say is that very often we talk about job creation. And I mean, everywhere you go in every African country, I think it started from Obama. So Obama says job, jobs, jobs. So Africans say jobs, jobs, jobs. And it's been strange to me. The private sector is not wired towards employing people. I mean, if you run a business, you want to employ as few people as you can to maximize your profit. The only way to create jobs is to create economic opportunities. You don't just create jobs by saying you create it. You build an economy, and that economy, if you fixed power, for example, just fixing power creates job opportunities. In every village, somebody can be a mechanic, he can be a hairdresser, you know, you can have a small grinding machine. You don't have to create a job for him, just give him power and he'll find the job. If a farmer does not have access to the markets, build the rural roads, build the commodities exchange, bring the telecoms infrastructure that he can use his phone, you know, and receive information on. That is all the government should do. When I hear government saying, I want to create jobs, you know, meanwhile, you're not building an economy. Just fix power. Don't create fixed power. People will get the jobs. And I think this is what we need to start talking about. And I think, and in a sense, when we talk about political rhetoric is possible because we in civil society, or those of in civil society, allow it. Anybody tells you he wants to create a job, tell him to jump out of the window. Just fix power, please. You know, just give me power, give me roads, give me security, I will find the job. Okay? But everywhere you go, we want jobs, jobs, jobs. Meanwhile, the opportunities do not exist. Usually, I try not to spend too much time reading a paper. It's very boring. And I'd like to do a Q&A so I know exactly what you would like to ask or hear. I have tried very hard not to be controversial, even though the day is not yet over, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. And I can see a few journalists, and I'm sure they'll find some headline that is slightly... sometimes when I read the headlines, I wonder if I was the one speaking, but that's it. I think I'd like to stop here and take